The Sahara Hotel in Las Vegas hummed with the desperate energy of hope. September 5th, 1976. Jerry Lewis's 19th annual MDA telethon stretched into its final hours, phones ringing in frantic symphony as America opened its heart and wallet for Jerry's kids. Under the blazing television lights, the king of comedy commanded his stage like a general marshaling troops against an invisible enemy, his voice hoarse from 20 hours of pleading, cajoling, and performing miracles of endurance that only pure love could sustain. But in the wings, leaning against a wall with that signature nonchalance that made tuxedos look like pajamas, Dean Martin watched his former partner with eyes that held 20 years of silence. The crowd didn't notice when Frank Sinatra whispered something urgent in Dean's ear. They didn't see the almost imperceptible nod, the way Dean's hand trembled just once before he smoothed it down his lapel. To the millions watching at home, he was still the effortless crooner, the man who could slide through life without disturbing the air around him. The band kept playing, but something had shifted in the universe. When Frank announced his friend who loves what you do every year, the words hung in the air like smoke. Dean stepped into that merciless spotlight as if he were walking into his own past, and Jerry Lewis, the man who could talk his way through any silence, suddenly couldn't remember how to breathe. The embrace that followed lasted only seconds, but it carried the weight of 2 decades. America saw reconciliation. They saw the healing of Hollywood's most famous wound. But the cameras missed the most important moment. In the chaos of that standing ovation, as Jerry's tears mixed with stage makeup and the audience wept for their own lost friendships, Dean leaned close to the ear of the man who had once been his other half. What he whispered wasn't a joke or a pleasantry. It wasn't the kind of smooth line that had made him famous. In a voice stripped of every artifice, carrying a secret he had buried under 20 years of studied indifference, he spoke words that would finally explain why the coolest man in America had spent 2 decades looking like his heart was broken. Years later, a stagehand's grandson would find a yellowed program from that night, signed by both men, with a note scrawled on the back, "Some silences are louder than applause." He would ask his grandfather what it meant, and the old man would say, "I saw Dean Martin stop being Dean Martin for 30 seconds that night. I saw him become just a man who missed his friend." Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to September 5th, 1976, and the moment when forgiveness finally found its voice. March 1946. The 500 Club in Atlantic City reeked of stale cigarettes and broken dreams. Another second-tier venue where careers went to suffocate quietly between the floorboards. Jerry Lewis was 20 years old, all nervous energy and rubber limbs, pratfalling for a crowd that had already mentally checked out. Dean Martin nursed a whiskey at the bar, 28 going on eternity, his crooner act dying as slowly and surely as the ice melting in his glass. 2 men drowning in obscurity, both too proud to admit the water was already over their heads. What happened next defied every law of show business physics. Jerry's record skipped during his act. Dean, feeling generous or maybe just bored, sauntered onto the stage to help. Their improvised banter lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The audience, dead silent all evening, exploded into something approaching religious ecstasy. By sunrise, they had shaken hands on a partnership neither believed would survive the summer. Within 18 months, they were the most beloved act in America, making more money than small countries. It was perfect combustion. Dean was the lighthouse, steady and unshakable, the cool that allowed Jerry's manic storm to rage without destroying everything in its path. Jerry was the kite, wild and unpredictable, but Dean was the string. Without the string, the kite doesn't soar, it simply blows away in whatever direction the wind chooses. Together they created something that felt inevitable, as if God had designed them specifically to stand next to each other under hot lights and make an entire nation forget its troubles for 90 minutes at a time. But perfection has an expiration date, and Hollywood has never been kind to the quiet ones. By 1953, the machine they had built began consuming one of its creators. Jerry's physical genius was undeniable, transcending anything Dean could offer with just his voice and timing. Critics started calling Dean the straight man, then the sidekick, then eventually just the other one. Paramount executives held meetings about the Jerry Lewis brand. Directors framed shots around Jerry's elastic face. And Dean, the man who made everything look effortless, made his slow disappearance look effortless too. He never complained publicly, never leaked stories to Hedda Hopper or Louella Parsons. When reporters asked about Jerry's solo ambitions, Dean flashed that million-dollar smile and said his partner deserved every opportunity. He protected their image even as his role in it shrank from equal billing to supporting player to barely visible. The breaking point materialized in a Paramount conference room in 1955. 20 executives in thin ties and thick egos discussing the future of Martin and Lewis for 45 minutes. They strategized about Jerry Lewis projects, Jerry Lewis merchandise, the next 5 years of the Jerry Lewis empire. Dean sat there in his perfect suit, face revealing nothing, watching his partnership become someone else's solo career in real time. His name was mentioned twice, both times in relation to Jerry's schedule. Most men would have exploded. Most stars would have issued ultimatums, demanded respect, flipped mahogany tables. Dean Martin chose a different kind of rebellion. He went quiet. He realized that to save his soul, he would have to destroy the most successful partnership in entertainment history. Better to be a man than a myth, even if it meant becoming the villain in everyone else's story. July 25, 1956. The Copacabana, their 10-year anniversary show. The air thick enough to choke on. Halfway through their set, Dean put down the microphone, looked at Jerry with eyes that said more than any routine they had ever performed, and walked off the stage. For the first time in a decade, Jerry Lewis stood alone in the spotlight, the music still playing, trying to understand what had just died. The newspapers called it ego. Hollywood whispered about money and creative differences. But the real reason Dean Martin walked away from the greatest partnership of his life, a secret built on loyalty and sacrifice, and a quiet promise to protect Jerry's future, would stay buried for 20 years. And when it finally surfaced, it would change everything America thought it knew about the King of Cool. The morning after the Copa, Hollywood placed its bets. Jerry Lewis would soar. Dean Martin would quietly fade into comfortable obscurity. After all, who needed the straight man once the genius had learned to fly solo? The smart money said Dean had 6 months before he came crawling back, hat in hand, begging for forgiveness and a chance to hold Jerry's microphone again. They were spectacularly, magnificently wrong. Jerry dove into his solo career with the desperation of a man outrunning abandonment, creating The Bellboy and The Nutty Professor, films where his genius was unquestioned and his pain barely disguised behind the laughter. Meanwhile, Dean faced the wilderness years that every discarded partner knows. Casting directors saw him as leftover furniture, a crooner past his prime, a nightclub relic gathering dust. Then came Rio Bravo. Howard Hawks saw something in Dean that almost no one else did. A deep stillness that could fill a screen without effort. Dean stepped into the role of Dude, the broken sheriff's deputy, and shed the Martin and Lewis skin like it had always been a costume. No mugging, no winks at the camera, just wounded, sober intensity that made his old drunk act look like prophecy. The audience leaned in. Critics blinked. Dean Martin was suddenly, undeniably a serious actor. Success followed, but not the loud kind Jerry commanded. Dean's ascent was quieter, steadier, building an empire one perfect note at a time. But Hollywood is a small town masquerading as a metropolis, and small towns force proximity on people who would rather live on different planets. An unspoken protocol emerged, managed by friends who became border guards. If Dean arrived at Chasen's and saw Jerry's car, he would suddenly remember another engagement. If Jerry was holding court at the Friars Club and someone mentioned Dean's approach, Jerry would discover an urgent phone call requiring privacy. What nobody knew What the gossip columns missed entirely was that Dean Martin had never stopped being Jerry's guardian angel. August 1960. Jerry's son Gary nearly died in a car crash on Mulholland Drive, the vehicle rolling 3 times before stopping against a telephone pole. The hospital bills mounted into figures that even Jerry Lewis money struggled to cover. Experimental surgeries, specialist consultations, months of rehabilitation that would bankrupt most families. The bills were paid, anonymously, routed through a shell corporation that took investigators decades to trace back to Dean Martin's business manager. Dean appeared in that hospital corridor like a ghost, hat pulled low, voice softer than prayer. He covered expenses nobody knew existed, stayed just long enough to ensure the boy would live, then vanished before sunrise. Gary Lewis would discover the truth years later, finding his supposed enemy's signature on old invoices marked paid in full. Dean joined the Rat Pack, found new brotherhood with Frank and Sammy, became the anchor of that legendary group. But friends noticed something peculiar. When late-night banter turned cruel, when jokes shifted toward Jerry Lewis, Dean would go quiet. Not angry quiet, sad quiet. He would check his watch, light a cigarette, change the subject. He refused to build his new castle on the ruins of his old friendship. A Paramount executive, speaking decades later with the freedom that comes from approaching death, revealed the final secret. During their 1956 split, Dean had personally negotiated Jerry's solo contract terms, using his leverage to secure better deals for the partner everyone assumed he resented. He had made sure Jerry would thrive without him, even if it meant starting from nothing himself. By 1965, Dean Martin had everything success could offer, but he was walking through life with a phantom limb. He had proven every doubter wrong, yet some holes cannot be filled with applause, no matter how thunderous. And somewhere, on late nights when the laughter died and the drink became more prop than comfort, he knew that one day he would have to break his silence and tell Jerry what he had really sacrificed for him. By the mid-60s, Dean Martin wasn't just a star. He was an atmosphere. He slid down a fire pole on NBC every Thursday night, and 20 million Americans felt like they were having a drink in his living room. He was the highest-paid entertainer in the world, the man who knocked the Beatles off the charts not with a scream, but with a shrug. But the real secret was this. Most nights, the glass in his hand was more prop than poison. The man America saw as carelessly intoxicated was, behind the curtain, meticulously in control, carrying himself like someone shouldering a burden only he understood. Jerry, meanwhile, lived at the opposite extreme. His empire grew through the late 60s, movies, stage shows, the MDA telethon swelling from charity events into moral crusades. But the late nights were getting darker. A back injury had led to a Percodon addiction that was slowly eating him alive, a chemical mask to dull the roar inside his head. The louder the applause, the more deafening the solitude when it stopped. They orbited the same Hollywood like twin planets with invisible gravity between them. The most haunting near miss occurred at LAX in 1968. Dean walked toward Gate 47, spotted Jerry at Gate 46, and their eyes met across 50 feet of terminal. For 3 seconds, witnesses said both men stopped dead, and the air between them seemed to vibrate with 12 years of regret. Then, simultaneously, as if choreographed by an invisible director, they both turned away. Not out of hate, but out of fear, the terror that if they started talking, the dam would break, and they might never stop crying. But love is stubborn, and it finds ways to speak when the voice refuses. When Dean's mother Angela died in 1967, a simple arrangement of white roses arrived at the funeral home. No card, no signature, just flowers arranged with a care that suggested intimate knowledge of her preferences. Dean stared at them for a long time, touched a single petal with a trembling hand, and whispered to his brother, "They're from him." He knew. Just as Jerry knew that the anonymous donations to the MDA telethon, checks that arrived quietly, year after year from a generic holding company in Beverly Hills, carried the unmistakable scent of Dean's loyalty. What neither man spoke of, what the world wouldn't understand for decades, was the legal architecture of their silence. Sealed files from a Hollywood law firm, opened long after both men were gone, would reveal the extent of Dean's martyrdom. In 1956, he had structured their split to maximize Jerry's solo prospects, taking public blame for being difficult to preserve Jerry's reputation with studios and audiences. The language was clear in Dean's handwritten notes in the margins. Creative control for Jerry. Back-end percentages increased. Future projects guaranteed. He had voluntarily taken the role of the villain, because it was the only way to ensure his friend remained the hero. For 20 years, Dean had allowed the world to believe he'd been the one who broke the act out of arrogance and boredom. He had carried that lie like a cross, choosing his friend's future over his own reputation. By 1976, watching Jerry stumble through the early hours of that 19th telethon, voice cracking, shoulders bowed under the weight of performing miracles for children who would never walk, Dean knew the time for silence was over. Frank Sinatra's wild idea, "Let's surprise Jerry, bring you out, heal this thing once and for all," suddenly felt like destiny calling. The King of Cool was about to do the one thing he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. He was going to feel, in public. And he was finally going to tell Jerry Lewis the truth. The Sahara Hotel felt like a cathedral in those final hours, heavy with the electric hum of 20 years' worth of unspoken words. Jerry Lewis moved through his 19th hour like a man whose bones were made of exhaustion and obligation, his voice reduced to a rasp that made every plea sound like prayer. The tote board climbed toward impossible numbers, but Jerry's eyes held the hollow look of someone who had been performing miracles on borrowed time for too long. In the wings, Frank Sinatra gripped Dean's elbow with surprising force, and for the first time in 2 decades, Dean Martin's carefully constructed mask flickered with something that looked dangerously close to fear. Dean stood against the wall, adjusting his cufflinks with hands that weren't quite steady. The tuxedo was perfect, the hair immaculate, the posture effortless as always. But his eyes betrayed him. They were fixed on the monitor showing Jerry, and for once, the trademark half-lidded gaze was wide open, raw, unguarded. When Frank whispered, "You don't have to do this," Dean didn't look away from the screen. His voice came out softer than prayer. "He's dying out there, Frank. He needs something he doesn't even know he needs." The walk onto that stage was the longest 30 feet Dean Martin ever traveled. Every step carried the weight of 20 years. Every breath tasted like regret mixed with hope. Behind him, the crew sensed history in motion. Ahead, Jerry finished another plea, his voice cracking on the word hope, unaware that his universe was about to tilt on its axis. Frank stepped into the spotlight with surgical precision, hugged Jerry, then dropped his line like a perfectly placed landmine. "I have a friend who loves what you do every year, and I think he might want to say hello." Dean appeared in that merciless light as if materializing from his own past. The noise that followed wasn't applause. It was a physical force. A tidal wave of shock and joy that threatened to blow the roof off Vegas itself. Jerry froze. For the first time in his life, the master of kinetic chaos was struck speechless. His hands flew to his face as if to shield himself from the impossible, then reached out instinctively before his mind caught up. 20 years collapsed into a single embrace that was awkward, clumsy, 2 men trying to remember how to fit together after growing into strangers. "You working?" Dean asked, and the audience laughed through their tears, thinking they were witnessing the touching end of a feud. The cameras captured the jokes, the tears, the way they held each other like drowning men finding solid ground. America saw nostalgia. The crew saw ratings gold. But what the microphones couldn't capture was happening in the space between their shoulders, in that pocket of noise where only 2 people could hear. As the standing ovation swelled into something approaching religious ecstasy, Dean leaned close to Jerry's ear. The words that came out weren't smooth or rehearsed. They were stripped of every defense he'd spent 2 decades building. He told Jerry about the Paramount meeting in 1956, the one where executives had made their choice clear with brutal efficiency. They wanted Jerry. Just Jerry. The partnership was holding back the real star, they'd said, and it was time to let genius fly solo. Dean's voice broke on words he'd rehearsed in his head for 20 years. "I never left you, Jer. They were going to drop me and keep you. I made it my idea. You had to be the hero. So I took the fall." Jerry's body went rigid, then started shaking with the seismic shift of understanding rewriting their entire history. All the anger he'd carried, all the nights he'd cursed Dean's name for abandoning him, suddenly had nowhere to land. But Dean wasn't finished. Pressing closer, voice barely audible above the chaos, he confessed the rest. He had negotiated Jerry's solo contract in secret, ensuring better terms than Jerry would have gotten alone. He had taken the public blame so Jerry could remain America's sweetheart. Every interview where Dean played the aloof cool cat, every shrug that suggested he'd never cared that much anyway, had been performance art designed to protect Jerry's reputation and future. And then, the final secret, he had never stopped being Jerry's guardian angel. The anonymous donations to MDA, the hospital bills, the quiet interventions that had shaped Jerry's life from the shadows. Jerry pulled back, just enough to see Dean's eyes, and for the first time since 1956, what he saw there wasn't cool detachment. It was vulnerability. Regret. A quiet, devastating love that had survived 20 years of enforced silence. On camera, it registered as simple overwhelm. At home, viewers dabbed at their eyes, thinking they were witnessing a happy ending. They had no idea they were watching forgiveness being born in real time, built on a truth that rewrote everything America thought it knew about the King of Cool and the price he'd paid for that effortless facade. The telethon cameras blinked to black, but the real story was just beginning in a cramped backstage corridor where two men sat surrounded by the debris of 20 years. Jerry slumped against a concrete wall, his tuxedo wrinkled beyond salvation. Makeup surrendered hours ago to exhaustion and tears. Dean stood across from him, no longer carrying the cartoon slouch of the lovable drunk, but the real sag of a man who had just set down a burden he'd been carrying since 1956. The air between them vibrated with the kind of silence that comes after confessions, heavy and fragile, and somehow sacred. Jerry started 3 sentences and abandoned them all before settling on the simplest truth his pride had never allowed him to speak. "I hated you for 20 years, he whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's, "and I was wrong the whole time, wasn't I?" The question hung in the air like smoke, 20 years of misplaced anger finally finding its way to the light. Dean's answer came without the smooth delivery that had made him famous. No punchlines, no deflection, just tired honesty stripped of every defense. He told Jerry about the checks, hundreds of thousands of dollars routed through 3 different shell corporations, all leading back to his business manager's desk, all made out to MDA. For years, Dean Martin had been one of the telethon's largest anonymous benefactors, writing checks in the dark to save Jerry's kids, while the world believed they were enemies. But that wasn't all. There were personal notes tucked inside those donation envelopes, jokes only Jerry would understand, references to old routines, simple words of encouragement written in Dean's distinct scrawl. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jerry managed, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of stagehands dismantling the miracle they'd just witnessed. Dean's response was painfully simple, delivered without bravado or performance. Because it wasn't about you knowing. It was about them getting help, and you keeping your pride. No winks at invisible cameras, no trademark half-smile. Just integrity, naked and unadorned, the way it had always been when the lights went down. The months that followed didn't produce a fairy tale resurrection of Martin and Lewis. That lightning had burned itself out decades ago, and both men were wise enough to know it. Instead, they built something quieter and infinitely more precious, a friendship forged not in the spotlight, but in the shadows where real life happened. Phone calls started happening, tentative at first, awkward conversations about grandchildren and golf scores. 2 men relearning how to exist in each other's orbit without the weight of performance between them. America, meanwhile, lost its collective mind over the reunion. The embrace became one of the most replayed moments in television history, analyzed and dissected until it became mythology. Talk shows debated whether the emotion was genuine or staged, missing entirely that what they'd witnessed wasn't a publicity stunt, but two men finally telling each other the truth after spending 2 decades drowning in enforced silence. The friendship that emerged was deliberately private, protected from the hungry eyes of a public that wanted to consume their reconciliation as entertainment. They met for lunch in the back booths of Italian restaurants in Beverly Hills, away from cameras. Two aging lions sharing bread and memories. Waiters would later whisper about seeing them laugh until they cried, about the way Dean would reach across the table and squeeze Jerry's hand when conversation turned to lost friends or health scares. Christmas cards appeared in mailboxes, signed with the casual affection that suggested normalcy had quietly returned. Then the universe delivered a blow so cruel it tested the structural integrity of their rebuilt bond. March 21, 1987. Dean Paul Martin, Dean's beloved son, disappeared during a routine Air National Guard training mission. The F-4 Phantom crashed into the San Bernardino Mountains during a blizzard, and for 3 agonizing days, search teams combed through snow and wreckage looking for survivors they would never find. Dean aged a decade in those 72 hours, his face collapsing into something unrecognizable. The man who had made everything look effortless suddenly looked like he was carrying the weight of a dead star. This time, it was Jerry who stepped into the void. No cameras, no statements, no performance. He simply showed up at Dean's Beverly Hills home and sat with his old friend in the darkened living room, sometimes for hours without speaking, understanding that grief has its own language and sometimes silence is the only vocabulary it recognizes. The roles had reversed completely. Now it was Jerry's turn to be the guardian angel, the quiet support, the one who stayed when everyone else's sympathy had expiration dates. Dean retreated from public life after that, becoming a ghost haunting his own legend. The performances stopped, the recordings ceased. The King of Cool simply turned off the lights inside himself and moved through the world like a man who had already checked out, but forgot to inform his body. But Jerry stayed in orbit, calling on birthdays, sending notes that said nothing important and everything essential, proving that the friendship resurrected in 1976 was strong enough to weather what their partnership never could. Real life, with all its unscripted tragedy. In his final years, Jerry made it his mission to correct the historical record. In interviews, his voice would crack when discussing Dean, calling him the most decent man I ever knew. Words that carried the weight of hard-won understanding. He told stories the public had never heard, anecdotes that revealed Dean's systematic generosity, his quiet heroism, the way he had spent a lifetime helping people who would never know his name. Jerry became the keeper of the flame, ensuring that history would remember Dean Martin not as the drunk uncle caricature or the cool cat who never broke a sweat, but as a man whose greatest performances happened off stage, in the dark, when nobody was watching. The pattern was finally visible to anyone willing to look. Dean's entire career had been an architecture of quiet sacrifice. He had protected Jerry in 1956, supported the telethon in secret for decades, chosen his friend's reputation over his own again and again, because that's what love looked like when you stripped away the spotlights and applause. The King of Cool had spent his life making the hard choices look easy, and only now, in the twilight of both their lives, was the true cost becoming clear. He had carried other people's burdens so effortlessly that no one realized he was carrying them at all. Until the weight finally broke something permanent inside him, and the only person left who truly understood was the friend he had loved enough to let go, and loved enough to come back for when it mattered most. Christmas Day, 1995. Dean Martin slipped away from the world as quietly as he'd lived in it, his heart finally surrendering in the early morning hours, while most of America was opening presents and pretending dysfunction didn't exist behind the wrapping paper. The official cause was acute respiratory failure, but anyone who truly knew him understood the real diagnosis. He had died 8 years earlier when his son's plane went down in the San Bernardino Mountains, and his body had simply taken this long to catch up with his broken spirit. The King of Cool left behind a legacy of effortless performances and a secret architecture of kindness that would take decades to fully excavate. Jerry Lewis received the news while sitting in his study, surrounded by photographs spanning 50 years of shared history. The grief that followed wasn't the theatrical kind Jerry had spent a lifetime perfecting. It was the quiet, devastating realization that he would never get to say thank you one more time, never get to tell Dean that he finally understood the magnitude of what had been sacrificed on his behalf. What Jerry discovered in the weeks after Dean's death rewrote their entire story one final time. Cleaning out Dean's Bel Air home, his children found a leather portfolio tucked in the back of a closet, filled with letters Dean had written over 20 years, but never mailed. Page after page of apologies, explanations, expressions of love that had lived and died in the dark. Letters addressed to Jerry, dated from every year of their separation, each one a window into the private anguish Dean had hidden behind his trademark shrug. Some were funny, vintage Dean humor trying to lighten the weight of regret. Others were devastatingly honest, confessions written at 3 a.m. when the mask had become too heavy to wear. Deanna brought the letters to Jerry personally, watching her father's old partner read them in silence, his hands shaking, tears falling onto ink that had waited decades to be witnessed. In those pages, Jerry finally understood that the sacrifices hadn't ended in 1956. They had continued year after year, a systematic protection of Jerry's reputation that Dean had maintained even when it would have been easier to claim his martyrdom. Slowly, the dam broke throughout Hollywood. Stories began surfacing that painted a portrait vastly different from the drunk caricature the world thought it knew. A makeup artist revealed Dean had paid for her child's tuition for 4 years. A struggling comic shared how Dean had slipped him $5,000 after a bad set, saying only, "Kid, you're funny. Don't quit." The industry reckoning was swift and emotional. People realized that the King of Cool wasn't indifferent. He was protective. His detachment wasn't arrogance. It was armor. Jerry spent his remaining years on a crusade to rewrite history. In every interview, every documentary appearance, he fought to ensure the world remembered the man, not the myth. When interviewers brought up the split expecting gossip, Jerry would stop them cold and tell the real story. He spoke about Dean's character with the fervor of a man racing against his own mortality, sharing anecdotes of anonymous generosity that had shaped dozens of lives. Modern audiences, discovering Dean through streaming and social media, found something revolutionary in his quietness. Here was a man who had possessed genuine power and used it to lift others without demanding credit. In an age of performative authenticity, Dean's systematic anonymity felt like a rebuke to everything contemporary culture valued. When Jerry Lewis died in 2017, he left behind more than films and telethons. He left a revised narrative that revealed Dean Martin as the moral center of their partnership, the gravitational force that had kept Jerry's chaos from spinning into destruction. Their reconciliation became a cultural touchstone, proving that forgiveness was possible, that silence could be broken, that two people who had wounded each other deeply could find their way back to love. September 5th, 1976, 2 men, one whispered secret, and the understanding that the greatest performance of Dean Martin's life wasn't on any stage. It was the 20 years he spent loving a friend in silence, protecting him from a distance, and waiting for the moment when forgiveness could finally find its voice. The King of Cool had been the warmest heart in Hollywood all along.